What's up, y'all? So let's talk about Ruthless Aggression, episode 4, the Brock Lesnar episode. Here come the pain. So let's look at some of the notes. One of my notes was Paul Heyman mentioned that Brock had a tendency to get bad advice, and essentially Brock was told to wrestle like a giant in the '80s for to never go down. If he gets hit, he doesn't bump. He takes a knee, he staggers or whatever, and that he was moving too fast and all those sorts of things. And Paul thought that was bad advice. That Brock was getting bad advice and being held down. And I'm not entirely sure that was wrong. I mean, far be it from me to argue with Paul Heyman, but well, the whole thing about Brock being fast. I mean, that it kind of you should show that with his size. You should show his speed. But it makes sense that a lot of the people that he was working with were so much smaller than him. It makes sense for him not really to sell, and that's really interesting. I mean, I thought that was an interesting point. Another interesting point that was brought up was that Brock beat Hulk Hogan, which I forgot completely about. I forgot all about that. It happened on SmackDown, I think it was. It was like on regular TV. He beat him with a bear hug, which was really weird. But he had, he wiped Hogan's blood on his chest and all that type of stuff. Like, it was insane. And it's not a match that people talk about a lot. And I wonder why. Maybe because Hogan lost. Maybe because it wasn't a big match. And I find it strange that Hogan did this kind of job, and Steve Austin was like, "Nah, we're not doing it." But Hogan's a little older than Austin, so maybe that's why Hogan didn't mind, and maybe Hogan thought he was gonna get that win back later. And I would have liked to have seen that for Hulkamania to make a return. Maybe not to beat Brock, of course, but for Hulk Hogan to do the job for Brock and at a random SmackDown, and then for him to come back later, and maybe Austin could have done the same thing. Could have did the job for Brock and then come back later. So I'm skipping around obviously, but the next point I had is the "is he ready" point, which is around the time that Brock was about to wrestle for the title against The Rock, and people were saying that maybe it was too much too fast, and Bruce Pritchard, I think, was the one who said, if not now, when? Because I think he had just beaten Hulk Hogan. He was, unbeatable, unstoppable monster. And it's a question of, if not him, if not Brock, then who? Who is the next guy if not Brock? And if you're not going to put the title on him now, then when are you going to put the title on him? And I think this question should be asked pretty much of every time that they are in a position like this. And maybe they do ask this question that, if you're not going to get the guy the title right now, when are you going to give the guy the title? And I think this is an interesting question that they asked themselves and that they were debating before they decided to pull the trigger on Brock. And it makes sense. Well, I think the decision was kind of made on their behalf because Rock was leaving regardless. So it kind of made the decision easy. But you had to take the title off the Rock, come hell or high water, but it didn't have to be Brock Lesnar. And they chose Brock Lesnar because of his massive size and his skill and ability and his pedigree, with his wrestling background, his amateur background, which I was actually impressed they was actually able to find footage of Brock, from ESPN and all that type of stuff. So then they asked the question after he won the title, was it too much too soon? That Brock Lesnar he's an antisocial guy. The old story of Brock doesn't like people. He's a very private guy. He doesn't really want to do a lot of these media appearances and different things like that. And he doesn't really want to do it. And the schedule was making Brock miserable. And this was very interesting because this is why Brock left. That, they gave him so much so fast because they believed in him. And Brock was miserable because of it, It was just so much. He was overwhelmed. He was too young to handle the responsibility that they were putting on him. And he cracked under the pressure, kind of, and he was dealing with injuries and dealing with, sacrificing his family and different things like that. And I think that these are interesting things, too, because we hear so much about how the schedule of the WWE is brutal, the brutal schedule, how terrible the schedule is. And Brock is a young guy. He was like 24 or something like that. And he still couldn't take it. Like, he just couldn't handle it. He couldn't deal with it. and that was interesting. Of course, we already knew that. Like if you've been watching wrestling a long time and you learn the story of Brock Lesnar, you know that he didn't like to travel. That's why his schedule is what it is right now. It's because he kind of hates traveling and being around. And I think it probably has something to do with size. Because I think the Big Show also used to talk about that. Traveling for the Big Show is a pain in the ass because he's so big that he gets a lot of attention, and then a lot of things has to be custom made for him. So traveling is a pain in the ass. And I think for a lot of big guys, traveling is the worst. And Brock is a big dude. He's tall, but he's also wide, like as far as his shoulders and back and shit. So I'm pretty sure that was a god awful time for him. So he decides to leave at less than 2 years into the company. And, they were saying, there was some bitterness on the company side of it because they had gave Brock the keys to the kingdom and he had walked out. He even had a private plane and a private jet just to get him to and from these shows so he can kind of avoid traffic and make traveling easier, but it didn't work. And it was real bizarre that Brock just kind of wanted out. And the company was actually pretty bitter about it. And I think this is why they kind of do what they do as far as a little bit of the cutting legs out of under guys, And I don't really believe they do it a lot, but I think they do it enough so that guys don't lose a really hot commodity when the guy leaves. So you don't want the guy, like, John Moxley, he kind of left on a high note because he left on the Shield note. If they'd have just jobbed John Moxley out to EC3 and just kept jobbing him out, then it probably wouldn't have did any different when he showed up in AEW. But they kind of let him go out on a high note, which was really weird. So they talked about WrestleMania 20, which they said they blamed it kind of on the internet and social media and the dirt sheets, telling people that both Brock and Goldberg are leaving. And that people chanted, "You sold out," and chanted boring. And, mentally, Brock couldn't deal with it. And he was flipping out. And he was flipping people off. And there's an interesting situation here where Matt Hardy said, you're not just leaving WWE, you're leaving me too. Meaning the audience is saying, you're not just leaving the company, you're also leaving us. And this kind of was the attitude for wrestling fans for a long time. Especially people who were fans of Brock Lesnar at the time, that when he left, especially, and then they kind of skipped over this a lot, that a lot of the Brock talking shit about wrestling, his bitterness towards the wrestling business, which he carried with him to Japan, which they also skipped over. They didn't talk about Brock being in Japan at all, which is interesting because Nakamura and Kurt Angle are two guys that he wrestled in Japan. And they both work in WWE, so like, why wouldn't they talk about Brock's time in Japan? At least just to talk to those guys about what Brock was doing in Japan. But I guess it didn't matter. But this was a strangely kayfabe discussion where there was no mention of Sable at all. There was not even a picture of Sable. She was not mentioned at all in this entire episode, which I thought was really weird. I didn't expect him to go into any real detail about his relationship with Sable or about anything like that. But for her to not be mentioned, I think she's pretty interesting. That's what I mean by this is, pretty kayfabe. And I think this kind of ties into the whole Brock is a private guy. He probably just didn't want people talking about it. Which is, I guess, his prerogative. But Brock also did not appear in this documentary at all. He didn't participate in this joint at all. Usually in the other documentaries, you have the guy, in the John Cena episode, you had the guy sitting down talking. Batista talking and Randy Orton, they did their spots for the Evolution episode. Brock did not do any new material for this documentary. He didn't show up. It was just basically Paul Heyman and a bunch of other people talking about Brock, and Brock almost breaking his neck at WrestleMania and all that type of stuff. But I thought that was the downside, is that we really didn't talk about Brock personally, and we didn't get to hear from Brock personally. Even if for him to say, like, to explain why he left himself or explain why he came back himself, just nothing, just no extra information at all. It was a necessary episode to have because Brock was such a huge part of the Ruthless Aggression era. He fits the Ruthless Aggression mold perfectly, as far as being ruthless and aggressive. So, but Brock Lesnar is a freak of nature, man. He's a mixture of fundamentals because he has that amateur background and, brutal shoot physicality. I mean, the suplex city, the viciousness of his approach to the business is amazing. And, some people just do not give Brock Lesnar the credit he deserves because he doesn't work every Monday or whatever. But if you compare what Brock is able to, he doesn't have to do a 30-minute match. And you wouldn't want to met Brock Lesnar in a 30-minute match anyway. Who can really last 30 minutes with Brock Lesnar? And that doesn't really make much sense. And I guess you want to kind of push it as being realistic as possible. And realistic as possible, wrestling Brock Lesnar is wrestling a fucking bear. Like you're not going to have a shoot 30-minute match with a bear. It's just not going to happen. You're going to get mauled. Or you're either going to kill the bear really fast or the bear's going to kill you really fast. It's one way or the other. And I like that. It's different. It's a different approach. Like, we've seen Brock do long matches. The idea that Brock can't work a long match is stupid. We've seen Brock do 1 hour Iron Man matches with Kurt Angle. We've seen him do 15 to 20-minute WrestleMania main events. We've seen him do that stuff. We don't need to see him do that stuff again. Like, we know what he can do. Now that he's like the streak killer, the guy who broke the streak, the guy who dominated John Cena. Now it's these beautiful short sprint matches where either Brock destroys you or you get a pinfall on him. But either way, the match is over in 6 minutes. Okay, so, I can really appreciate that. But I think this was the weakest episode of the Ruthless Aggression documentary so far because there was no new information. We didn't talk to anybody who was really close to Brock other than Paul Heyman. We learned a lot about Brock, but mostly from other people. And the stuff that we did learn was stuff that we already knew, that Brock was impatient, that he didn't really want to waste time in OVW. He wanted to get on TV, that he hated traveling. He doesn't really like people. He liked living in the middle of nowhere. He wanted to be the champion, but he didn't want to travel and do the schedule and all that type of shit. That he left and played football and did MMA and all that type of stuff. And yeah, we learned all that, but we already knew that stuff. As far as things that we didn't really know, most of that stuff was basically around the company's decision to push Brock, why they pushed him, and that sort of thing. And that's about it. This episode really was kind of the weakest of all the episodes so far, but it was still okay. But, all right, so what did you guys think of this episode? Like, share, and subscribe, and we'll talk about it in the comments.